So hello, welcome today to a break from the systematic review series we've been doing. We wanted to share some information about the Deep Blue documents and data repositories from the University of Michigan. So we have our colleagues here from Ann Arbor from that team. We have Rachel Woodbrook and Peter Serta here with us today. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them. They're going to go through the slides, and then we'll have obviously time for questions at the end. So I'll turn it over to them. Thank you, guys.
Great. Thank you, Emily, for that introduction. I'm really excited to chat with you all about the repositories that we run. So as Emily mentioned, I'm Peter Serta, the data curation specialist for workflows and big data. And joining me is my colleague, Rachel Woodbrook, the data curation specialist for humanities, social science, and medicine. Next slide. Okay, since we are on Zoom, please use chat for any questions or comments throughout the presentation. And please keep your mics muted, though you can unmute during the Q&A session. We will have closed captions available. And if you're watching this while the workshop is, if you're watching the recording, this workshop is recorded, and slides and recording will be shared with you afterwards. So what we're going to chat about today is kind of go over a rough overview of the Deep Blue documents and Deep Blue data, our two institutional repositories. There are differences between the two, so if we can chat, we'll chat about which repository you should use when. Do a little bit of a demo about how to deposit into each repository, and then end with how do you get some help when something goes wrong. Yeah. So I should introduce the team before we get into the nitty-gritty. So we are the Deep Blue Repository Research Data Services team, otherwise known as DBRRDS. And because we love acronyms, we decided we should also have a mascot, which is a bird. A little on the nose, but okay. So our goal is to help y'all share the teaching, learning, research, and creativity that you produce throughout the entire system. So while we're based in Ann Arbor, we're not just an Ann Arbor service, we service all three campuses. And we do that by overseeing and providing support for our two repositories, Deep Blue Documents and Deep Blue Data. Next slide. So when you reach out to us, you're going to get a response from one of four people. Joanna Thielen, who is our lead data curation specialist and also oversees science and engineering, the STEM fields. And then you might also hear from Rachel Woodbrook, as I mentioned earlier, the specialist for humanities, social science, and medicine. If you have what we call big data, basically a data set that's over 5 gigabytes or has over 100 files, you'll probably end up hearing from me. And if your data set involves code or software, you might hear from our data curation specialist and our research reproducibility specialist, Daniel Alexander, who has a joint position with us and Midas. We also have our director, Jeremy Moore, who oversees our services as well as the publishing technology group in Michigan Publishing. So we've talked a lot about these repositories, but we haven't actually told you what they do or what they are. So the Deep Blue repositories are basically a means for y'all, the U of M community, to make your work openly accessible to anyone with an internet connection. And I really do mean anyone. We often field questions from people from all over the globe, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, South America. Like, it really is a worldwide service anyone can access. And so when you typically think of depositing a piece of work, you might be thinking about depositing a journal article, but we really do think of these repositories as a way to share not just your journal article, but a lot of other things that might not have a predefined dissemination path. So you could think of student reports, technical reports, presentations that you might give on a piece of research, things like that. We would love to have and make available to others. But that leads to the question, why share your work? to share your work is really helping others gain access to your research so that they might be able to use it in new ways. So, obviously in the academic fields, we kind of base a lot of our research off of things that others have done. So by sharing your work, you're making it easier for others to access that work to help fuel their research. Next slide. And so why use the Deep Blue repositories? I will say that there are other repositories that might be more suited towards your needs, and we're more than happy to help you get set up with them. So, for example, if you work with genetic sequences, by all means, submit your data with NCBI GenBank. That's where people are going to know to go to look for this data. But if you're looking for a generalist repository, or if you don't have necessarily a domain-specific repository to go to, by all means, use us. We are indexed by Google and other search engines, so your work will be searchable by others. And every deposit is going to be assigned a unique identifier, otherwise known as a DOI. And this DOI will always link back to this page with your work. We do provide basic preservation for all format types, though we would love it if you could submit your work in an open format, such as like PDF, things like that, so that they're readable by future applications. And another thing too is many funding agencies are starting to require the public sharing of your results, your data, the papers. So we're going to start to see a little bit more requirement from the top down on sharing your work. Next slide. So our first platform is Deep Blue Documents, and this is where a lot of our articles, books, chapters, presentation posters, media syllabi, basically anything you can traditionally think of as a document is going to be stored. Next slide. And then we have another repository known as Deep Blue Data. And this is where we prefer to have the finalized data set that supports your research, whether it be the raw or the processed data. And this includes, code, media, videos, all that fun stuff.
All right. So Peter has given a great overview of a lot of these, technology, a lot of the pieces of what we do. And we don't only work with the repositories, we do work with the research lifecycle in general, wherever folks are at. I'm going to dig in a little bit deeper and give you a specific example and then talk a little bit more about the process. And we're also going to do a few quick demos of using the systems. So the example we'd like to use is this one. It's of a Dearborn researcher who published this study on detecting machine obfuscated plagiarism, which basically means folks using plagiarism, but trying to use technology to make it less clear that they were plagiarizing. So they published their conference paper, but you'll notice here that it costs $29.95 for a member of the public who doesn't have access through an institution already to access it, which sometimes that might be worth it, but it can add up pretty quickly. However, they were also able to deposit a copy into Deep Blue Documents, and we can work with folks to determine what rights you've retained, even to published articles. Oftentimes, you can't post the final version right away, but there's often a path to post either the submitted version or to do it after an embargo. And so because of that, anybody with an internet connection can now read this work, and it's freely accessible. And we can also point back to the journal record from our repository if they would like, for instance, if it's a slightly different version. And so in this case, they would just click on that file title to access it. In this case, they actually also deposited the underlying data set in Deep Blue Data. And one thing that is nice here is you can see that they've deposited raw text used for training. So this isn't just necessarily the data directly underlying, say, figures in the article, but it may be the entirety of the data set they were working with which is what we often encourage folks to think about if they're in a position to do that. It can allow people not only to look at what you did, but to sometimes draw their own conclusions and build on your work. And so now anybody who's interested can also download and reuse the data within the terms of the license. And one of the things that we often do as well is encourage folks to deposit this data as part of the process of submitting and publishing their manuscript, and then to add the DOI into the manuscript so that folks reading the published article, even in the journal, are able to get access to the data set and know that it's available there. We also, you can see here, the top file is a README. We require all data sets to have documentation that's human readable, just to explain the context and give people a way to orient themselves. Talk a little bit more about that momentarily. So you might have noticed that both of these are called Deep Blue documents and Deep Blue data. And the difference between them is not necessarily in the type of material, right? Like we have, say, audio and video files in both repositories. It's really more about how it's meant to be used. And so, say, oral histories that are meant to be viewed by people might go into Deep Blue documents, whereas video used to code snake movements is an example of something that we have in Deep Blue data that's really more about sort of being transparent about the methodology of the research. We also have this handy chart to explain some of those differences and similarities. Both are free to folks at the University of Michigan to use in terms of depositing, and they're free to everybody publicly to access. We do, as we're part of the library, we do have a commitment to preservation along with the rest of the library. We're part of that. We do mint unique and persistent identifiers that you can add into documents or put on your resume or CV and know that those won't get broken over time. They're indexed by Google and in a couple of other places. For example, Deep Blue Documents is also tied in with PubMed. And so oftentimes you can click through to Deep Blue from PubMed. We can assign licenses to your work, which basically just means that you can sort of pre-grant some uses so that folks don't need to try to contact you for particular types of uses. And then we do have the ability in docs, a little bit more so, to restrict access. So we do have, for example, collections that are accessible based only on sort of IP address or location. The biological station is one place that that's the case. We do have an option for folks to have sort of metadata only records. If they don't have the right to deposit, almost always authors retain the right to their articles to at least share individual copies with individuals who ask them. And so we're able to facilitate that with our system, although in that case, the author does need to be paying attention to their email because they will need to manually accept those requests and share. We facilitate, like we host the article and they're able to share it through the system, but they need to make that decision individually and do it manually. Click the button manually. In Deep Blue documents, everything there is intended to be eventually publicly accessible. So we do have an embargo period, but we don't have a long-term access restriction option. And one other thing to highlight is that so these repositories were created at different times. Deep Blue Documents was built and launched in 2006. Deep Blue Data didn't become a thing until 2016. They are on different platforms, unfortunately, for the time being. And because of that past, they also have slightly different policies. So for Deep Blue Documents, students will need to get permission from a faculty member to deposit their work. We also work with departments to intake, and with some of the librarians at your campus to intake theses and dissertations that are the basis of degrees. Deep Blue Data, both faculty and graduate students can start a deposit on their own without being added to the system by us manually, although we do check each of those records before publication. And just as an illustration of the difference in scale as well, Deep Blue Documents has between 150 and 200,000, I believe, items, deposits in it. And Deep Blue data is just about at 1,000. So going over a little bit some of what I've said and what Peter has said, because it isn't super transparent. In deciding what repository to use, really the guideline is how it's intended to be consumed and used once you let go of it. So if it's a document, if it's human readable, and it's the basis of your research, teaching, or learning, we'll offer Deep Blue documents. As I mentioned, faculty and staff can add to or request collection access online. So if you sign in and you don't see a collection in the dropdown, just drop us an email at deepblue@umich.edu. Let us know your department or what collection you think you should be added to, and we can take care of that and send you instructions to get started. Students can deposit with faculty approval, and that right now is both undergrad and graduate students. And what that looks like is just having a faculty member who knows their work email us and say, yes, I would like this student to be able to deposit in this collection. And in Deep Blue documents, once you decide that your deposit is ready to go, in both repositories, you can save items as a draft while you work on them. But once you choose submit, it will go immediately online and be publicly available. I do want to highlight that you can get a DOI before making your work public if you're trying to do something like add the DOI into another work. On the other hand, if it's data, the distinction here being if it's mainly intended to be machine readable, maybe analyzed, we encourage you to use Deep Blue data. And also, if you make a deposit into data and it actually belongs in docs, because we look at all of the deposits and data, we'll help you figure it out. We'll reach out. We'll ask you some additional questions about what it is that you're hoping to accomplish. Faculty, research staff, and grad students can all start deposits online without talking to us first. You can also save those as a draft. If you do have questions, we're always happy to meet with folks, regardless of what point you are at in your process. In fact, we like it when people get in contact with us before they're at the end needing to deposit, because oftentimes if there are things that would make it easier come the end, it's easier to make those adjustments the further back in the process, or the closer to the beginning of that process you are versus the end. And then for Deep Blue data, I would say the biggest difference is that once you submit it, you're not submitting it to the open web. You can still get a DOI beforehand. We can also share a link if you are submitting to a journal and they want to review the data as well as your manuscript. But you should expect some data curation on our end and communication, a little bit of back and forth before publishing. And the reason that we have that difference in policy is that there's a long history and tradition of sort of text publishing, right? And I think that most people have a pretty good sense of what it means for a piece of writing to be publishable. So you draft it, you get it edited, maybe you revise it. And once somebody has looked it over and you've made those changes, because it's intended for other humans are able to just look at that and say, yes, this is now making sense and sufficient, and it goes through that publication process. For data, there's not, and for some other things, like I would say for some of the gray literature Peter was talking about, like technical reports or conference presentations aren't necessarily articles that go through that peer review and editing process. However, they're still intended for audiences generally. But for data, it's much less clear. And I would say there's not even a consensus across disciplines about what it means for a data set to be publishable. And so we work with everybody who submits a data set to make sure that for sort of naive experts, such as ourselves, where we're not an expert in your discipline, but we do know what makes a data set sort of comprehensible to somebody who hasn't been part of that research project. We work together with folks to make sure that there's enough context added to make sure that the work has gone in to make something usable by others. Oftentimes, if you've worked on something for years, there's so much knowledge in your own head, and it can be hard to even remember what you didn't know or what somebody else might not know. All right, getting a little more hands-on, we're going to do a quick demo of Deep Blue documents. I've signed in as one of our colleagues at the Taubman Health Sciences Library. But what you can see is that, so the login button will be at the top right here. Once you're into the system, you can go to deposits. And what you'll see there, oh, this has taken me back to mine. That's not what I wanted. Well, what you'll see is at the top, you'll see any draft deposits that you have. And so if you click on those, you can go back to depositing them. And then if you scroll down, it will show you things that you've already deposited, when they were deposited, and the downloads for the month, as well as the downloads since, this says since February 2008. I think that's just the beginning of when the statistics go back to. So this was not deposited, you can see that far back. And nobody has downloaded these ones yet, but I was surprised to see, you know, that we're probably going to get 100 views of this other workshop we did eventually. If you want to start a new deposit, that's up here.
Rachel, can I break in real quick just to ask a question?
Yeah.
I've had some faculty who, when they've logged in, they haven't seen that deposit section. And I think that basically indicates, right, that they're not in the system. So if you are a faculty member and you log in and you don't see where you can do deposits, just either get a hold of the Deep Blue team or me, and we can make sure that you have that ability to do the deposits. But I have had some people that haven't had that capability quite yet. So if you don't see the deposits, just let us know.
Yes, thank you, Emily. And that is true. There's not an automatic way that folks get added to Deep Blue once they are hired. And so we do have to add folks manually, and usually we do it at the point of need. So yeah, just reach out to Emily, reach out to us, and that students as well as faculty, because if you're a student, we can also let you know what you would need to do to deposit. So once you have this, and you go to start a deposit, it'll tell you the collections that you have access to. And this list is going to be really long because it signed me in as myself and I have access to everything. But the collections that you're likely to see, oh my gosh, apologies, are going to be prefaced with research collections. These archival collections, that's the Bentley who we work with. But it won't be an overwhelming list. It'll probably be either nothing, in which case you contact us, or 1 or 2 collections that we've already added you to. Any questions about that interface? Feel free to drop in the chat.
And just a note for the EOM people, we've asked Deep Blue to make collections based on the major academic units. So College of Health Sciences, College of Arts and Sciences, which we will obviously change that to whatever new name that college comes under, as the schools, and CIT as well. So those are probably going to be the main ones that you would be asked to be able to deposit in.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Yeah, Joanna, before she went out on leave, worked with the librarians at Flint to reorganize all of those collections. And if you have any questions about what deposit or what collection you should deposit in, feel free to talk to your librarians and or ask us. We can help you figure it out. All right. So Peter has already talked a little bit about why share your work in general. And I think those points also apply to data, but there are also some specific things. I think it's less common for people, depending on the discipline, to think about their data as a research product that needs to be shared. But we are seeing that there is an increasing requirement by funding agencies and publishers that they do want data to be available. This is coming both from the federal level. The NIH, for instance, has recently shifted their policies. The Office of Science and Technology Policy has also put out a memo requiring all federal agencies for all extramural grant amounts to have a public access policy. And so we're likely to see a lot more of those coming out in areas beyond health. That policy, or that requirement, is going to come into effect in January 2025, I believe. And many journals also now want you to demonstrate that you have your data accessible somewhere. But beyond that, it can help others better connect with your research, understand either your methodology or the conclusions that you came to It can help science, and it can help you. There is some research that suggests that sharing your data results in an increase in citations, which is sort of something that makes sense, common sense wise, that if it's more accessible, more people would be reusing and citing it. But it is nice to see research on that area. And this is, of course, one of the reasons why it's important to put those DOIs for data into your articles when the data is available, because DOIs are one of the ways that can be tracked and that systems can tell that the data was reused. There's still not a full consensus on how data are cited when they're reused, which is another area that we help folks figure out what to do. And then one other thing I wanted to highlight is that in a lot of fields, researchers have historically expected to share their data through statements in journals, such as saying the data are available upon request. But I did want to highlight this recent study where the authors analyzed thousands of articles, reached out to authors who had those data availability statements that it was available upon request, and they were ultimately only able to contact, heard back from 7% of people total. And then I think of those only, or maybe this is part of the total, but 6%, basically they were not able to get the data over 90% of the time, even when they followed the process outlined. And that could be because the researcher declined to share it because they only wanted to share it with people they were collaborating with, or it could just be because it had been a while and the researcher maybe didn't remember where to get access to that. So basically, data availability statements that just say, contact me to get the data are not true availability. And the federal requirements coming out are leaning away from those too. I also do want to highlight that this is not to say that all data needs to be shared, because of course, especially in health, there are, or anytime you're working with human subjects, there are considerations around privacy, around confidentiality, around potential harm, and you want to make the decision that is most ethical for your work. I think the point here, though, is that rather than assuming that things cannot be shared or don't need to be shared, to ask that question and to really think through and be able to explain, if you're not going to share it, why it's not appropriate to share. And this is an area that we have lots of conversations about. Folks have all sorts of ideas and opinions, and we love to talk about it. Yeah. But I won't dwell on it today. And lastly, in terms of why share, I wanted to highlight that the University of Michigan does have a new research data stewardship policy. This is on the website as of June. And this is consistent with policies such as the NIH and OSTP memo that I was talking about. It basically indicates that investigators should strive to make their research data publicly available at the time of publication if it's appropriate, and that they should do so in a manner consistent with the FAIR principles. That stands for findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. And we don't have time to go into those now, but those, basically that means that you can put something out, but if it's just, say, the file from your desktop that you were using and it hasn't been curated for other folks to be able to understand it, just because it's available doesn't necessarily mean that it's useful. And a lot of the work that we do is to help people make sure that the data are useful and trustworthy, as well as these other adjectives. And lastly, we do want to acknowledge, we do this for work. We struggle to do this sometimes in our own research and work. We do understand that it takes labor. And I think that that's part of the reason that I see these increased acknowledgements and requirements coming from federal agencies as a positive. Of course, there will need to be increased infrastructure to support people in being able to meet those requirements ethically. But it's also a step toward acknowledging the labor that goes into sharing data. Again, if you put something out without thinking about the audience, it may not be easy for people outside of the research project to understand the data or even if they can understand it, if there's not enough context to trust it or to reuse it, it can be hard on you as the depositor to understand or to put yourself into that role and to decide how you should prepare the data for others to use. And it does require an investment of time and attention and effort over, if you're doing it well and at minimizing the effort, probably over the entirety of the project, rather than all right at the end. It can be done most of the time, but it can be more stressful. For instance, if you are able to come up with naming conventions and organization before you've collected all your data, it's much easier to go back and locate what it is that you want to share. So here is our not sales pitch, but free pitch, that luckily you're not alone in having to figure out how to do this. We can help you at all stages. If you need to write a data management and sharing plan for a funding proposal, we can help you with that. We have some language you can put into those plans about using Deep Blue data. We're also happy to do individual consultations or to talk about whether Deep Blue data is the right repository for your data. We can also help you plan out what to do to implement that plan, because those plans are usually pretty short documents, but they're not really intended for that to be the entirety of what you do. It's much less useful when it's a checkbox and much more useful when it's a living document that you can kind of update and refer back to as you do your work to record and think about how you're actually managing your data. We can also help you describe your data, including a couple of the things I mentioned previously, like file naming or organization, deciding what context needs to be included with the data itself. That would be the metadata, and then also the documentation in terms of README or a research overview for somebody to situate themselves in your research as they look at the data set. We can help you meet the FAIR principles. And these are things, this aspect of things I would say we do mostly in the middle and end of projects, but thinking about it before you start is also always very useful. And finally, of course, we can help you share your data through Deep Blue data. We can also, as Peter mentioned before, help you deposit to a subject repository if that's a better home for your data. We can help you decide if your data belong in Deep Blue data and to think through, even if you're not depositing with us, the actions on the previous slide, how to make it useful and usable, how to decide what license you might want to apply to it, and how to prepare it so that it is optimized for preservation. For example, Peter was talking about format. If it's in an open format, it's more likely to be accessible farther into the future. So CSV is generally preferable over Excel, for example. And we're also happy to talk more about all these things in depth. We're also happy to do presentations to specific groups to talk through their labs, individual practices with them. We see our job as, providing education and assistance to folks across all three campuses and across the research life cycle. We are a small group, so it might take some time to plan things out, but we love it when folks are interested in devoting some time and effort to thinking about how to do this process, because that means it's many things that they do in the future are going to become easier for them. Just a couple more slides from me. I did want to very broadly introduce you to the process for depositing into Deep Blue data, since it's different than that for docs. We think of it in 4 basic steps, which are preparing your data for deposit, gathering all your files together, deciding how to organize them, preparing your documentation, so writing up an overview and a methodology, and this is often different than what would be in the article because that is a general research methodology, whereas for the data set, you want a data-specific methodology, so including things like the software and the software versions that you used. Submitting the data set through our interface. Peter's going to demonstrate that real briefly in just a moment. And you can see here, this is a screenshot where, first of all, you put in the required metadata. There's probably fewer than 10 fields that are required, but the more that you fill out, of course, the more informative the record's going to be. You can also see here that there's a tab for files. And so that's where you would upload your files. And it's once you upload your files that you're able to create a DOI. So the data curation review is the last step. That is something that we do, and we'll be in conversation with you about any updates that need to be made. Sometimes we'll make changes, especially to the documentation, but to minimize the chance of introducing mistakes, we usually don't make changes to the data itself. And that last piece, I think, is maybe the most different from what folks are oftentimes expecting, and different from Deep Blue documents. But we think of ourselves, we're part of Michigan Publishing, and one way to think about the work that we do is that it's kind of analogous to what an editor does, right? Seeing what comes in and seeing if any changes need to be made to make it more useful, understandable, trustable. So we look at it, and a lot of the value we offer is just that we're not involved in your work already. And so we're coming to it with fresh eyes, and we understand that we're not disciplinary experts, but we are pretty skilled at spotting areas like gaps for documentation in particular, where it might be useful to provide more information for somebody else to be able to make use of your work. The three areas that we focus on in our curation review are content, so the data files themselves, if they're all there, if there's missingness, we'll ask questions about that. The context, and that's the metadata and documentation. So the descriptions of what people should expect to find, what it means, how to use it. And then the connections between the components. That is probably most often a factor when folks are using code, and sometimes need to maintain, say, the file structure for the code to be able to find files where it's expecting to, and to be able to run. So if you submit code, we do try to run it depending on the code, depending on our expertise and what software we have and capacity we have. We may just come back to you with questions about the errors that we run into. But we try to do as much as possible to think about, if I were a user of this data, what issues am I running into that are barriers that are making it hard to reuse? All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Peter to wrap us up.
Okay. Right. So when you go to Deep Blue .lit, our Deep Blue data homepage, there will be a login button up in here in the top right corner, and you'll log in with your UMich credentials, and it should spit you back out here. And to deposit work, essentially you'll click on deposit your work, and they'll ask you to describe some metadata. This is essentially what gets used to make your work searchable on the internet. So I'll enter in a few autofills, but we do look for title, creator, and the creator we like to think of as not just the person depositing, but also the co-authors on the project, so that they also get credit for this data set. We also encourage creators to link their ORCID IDs, with their ORCIDs as well. And some of the metadata that we really spend a lot of time on is the methodology. So just like, how was this data set created? To give the readers a sense of how did these researchers create this data set. And then in our description metadata, we ask that the creators describe how this data set, like what the scope of the project itself was for the creation of this data set. And these are required fields. So I will enter these with a few numbers. And that's frozen. The other thing too is we offer licenses on these data sets. So these are traditional CC licenses. Some can be, and they have their own special requirements, which you're welcome to read through, or to reach out to us if you're having an issue trying to decide which one you would like to use. And then we also like to sort out our data sets based on what type of discipline it was. And then there are a few other metadata fields, your funding agencies, your ORSP grant numbers, and keywords. And keywords is really an important metadata field where you're able to enter terms that might broaden the search for your data set and might allow it to show up on more searches. Your citation to related material is essentially the publication that you're looking to, that this data set will be supporting. And then if that article happens to be in Deep Blue documents, we also encourage you to link your data set here or your document link here. Okay, and after that, we'll ask you to add and this is essentially where you'll be able to upload your data set. If your file happened to be greater than, or your data set happens to be greater than 5 gigabytes or more than 100 files, we ask you to click on this contact us, then you fill out a form, and then I'll be in touch with you about that. And then when you're ready to, when all your files have been uploaded, you have to check obviously this deposit agreement, but you're able to make this data set either openly accessible or set an embargo for future release. So this could be like when your paper is under review and you want your data set to be up, you can have it published. It just won't be viewable until that paper comes out, and then you can set it for a future date, and then also get in contact with us if you need to extend that or if it's available to be released earlier than that. If you're still in the process of getting all your files set, all your data set organized, you can save this as a draft and come back to it later, or you can submit, and if everything's already completed, you can submit it for review, and then one of the curators will be in touch with you with any recommendations to help make your data set more fair. Okay, I believe that is the end of my demo. Okay, so if go ahead and thank y'all and ask if y'all have any questions.
While people are thinking of questions, I just want to jump in and say too that even in the little bit of time I've known the Deep Blue people, it's like I always thought of it so much more as just a platform that people work with, but they really are a full service team that you can contact them and they can provide you with so much information across the whole data management landscape. So don't think of it as just a place to put your things. It's really a terrific resource, especially for us in Flint. We don't have necessarily that kind of support here. And they are available, and boy, when I contact them, they get with us, and they've really been a real asset to us. So I encourage students, faculty, definitely get in touch with them. And like they said, sort of thinking from it at the outset of your projects really can kind of help you to streamline the rest of your project, right? If you talk with them about how to manage your data, it'll just make it so much easier down the line, and they'll kind of be familiar with it, and everything will kind of work more seamlessly. But yeah, they are experts in this area. So when you have questions, get with them because they are so helpful. So Kathy, I see you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually I have a couple, but and mainly they surround what Peter just talked about with visibility and timing of submitting the data set, because if I'm going to want to make a data set available for the reviewers of my manuscript for acceptance into a peer-reviewed journal, can I just share it with the editor, which of course then will probably pass it along to the blinded reviewers? And I'm not sure how that all works. So if you would answer that question, and then I've got a couple others.
Yeah, so we actually do have the ability to provide an anonymous link, which we're working on refining that process. But essentially, this link will either give reviewers access to the data set via the actual deposit page, or it will just lead to a downloadable link where they will be able to download the data set. We're still refining the process because there is a little bit more murkiness around that. For example, it wouldn't be truly blinded. So we're working to try to make that a little bit more make it more accessible for those reviewer situations where it wants to be blinded or double blinded. So yeah, I think that's so. But yes, you are able to provide this either a DOI or this link to the editor, and then we can have yes, yeah.
And I'll just chime in to say too that so the DOI doesn't change, and so adding that to the manuscript ahead of time can work. The links that we create for reviewers are a little bit different. They work as long as the article isn't or as long as the deposit is not published. They're anonymous in that you can't tell who's using the link to access your deposit. The deposit is not anonymous, right? It's on our platform. It'll have metadata like your name. And so the reviewers will see that information.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to handle that from the journal's point of view, because that should be blinded when they're reviewing it and not see my information. So I'm not quite sure
We can
how to
work.
do that.
Yeah, if you get into a situation where you do need that kind of double blind, like Peter said, our platform unfortunately doesn't support that right now, but we could work with you to curate the data into the shape that you think it needs to be, and then maybe you share just the data or another platform like Dropbox or something with the reviewers. Yeah, we can still, in many cases, help, even if, yeah. Well, we can talk more.
Well, I would definitely be, seeking your help probably constantly throughout this whole process. So I appreciate your support in the future.
Yeah.
My other question, unless somebody else has a question, but my other question is, when you are submitting your proposal to IRB, either both IRBs, I'm assuming you need to let them know that you will be putting your data into the Deep Blue data repository. And I don't know if you already have wording for that, so that we state this appropriately for an IRB, an IRB application.
So we have language. Is it all right if I take this one, Peter?
Mm-hmm.
You can also, of course, follow up. We have language. The Deep Blue repository boilerplate language that we linked to in the presentation is generally talking about our commitment to preservation. And so the fact that we back up all of the data on tape, so it's not going to be lost in a disaster. Depending on what you are submitting to IRB and what your project is, I don't know that you would need to specify a particular platform, but you would want to make sure that you include it in probably your proposal, as well as your consent forms, if you are planning to deposit it for public access, which is what Deep Blue is. I'd say that's the thing that we run into most often, where if folks haven't planned to make it public from the start, it could be harder to do that at the end, especially if the consent form doesn't indicate that would be a possibility.
Okay, thank you for that, because I would want to make it the data set available to the reviewers first, and then of course if my manuscript is accepted for publication, then switch it to public.
And that's something you could do. You could keep it as a draft. You could keep it, there's a status in between where we're reviewing it, and we can make it available to others, like journal reviewers, but it's not publicly accessible. We just don't want to get into the situation where we don't want to stage the data and prep it and then find out, oh, actually it can't be made public for whatever reason.
So I'm sorry, will you just tell me again? It should be in the consent form and then somewhere else, I believe you said, in the proposal?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly which pieces of you would need to submit to IRB, but if there's, parts talking about dissemination of your work.
All right, well, Liz put a link into the chat for those who are here. If you could fill out a survey, just letting us know how you felt about the presentation. But I really do want to thank Rachel and Peter for taking the time out to talk to us about this. It's so important, and it's a really, really fantastic service for us to utilize here in Flint. And if you have any questions, their information is on the screen, and I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, but thank you for attending today.
Thank you for watching this recorded webinar. Find upcoming webinars to register for at libcal.umflint.edu.